Every parent's love is supposed to be unconditional, but sometimes the people we trust most can betray us in ways we never imagined. 8-year-old Sarah learned this heartbreaking truth when her own father abandoned her at a stranger's cabin in the Colorado mountains. What looked like punishment for breaking her mother's china was really something much darker. The mountain man who found her, Ezra McCallum, had been living alone for 20 years with his own secrets. When he opened his door to find the scared little girl, he didn't know her father had bigger plans. As winter came to the remote cabin, Sarah started learning that her abandonment wasn't random. Her father was hiding a terrible truth that could destroy their family. The mountains held secrets that only blood could reveal. But what was her father really planning, and why did it mean leaving his daughter behind? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like old memories refusing to fade, and Sarah Whitmore pressed her small face against the rough wooden door of the cabin, listening for the sound of her father's wagon wheels. But the mountain silence stretched on, broken only by the whisper of wind through the evergreens and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. She had been standing there for what felt like hours, clutching her worn cloth doll against her chest. The doll's faded blue dress matched her own, and its button eyes seemed to understand things that 8-year-old Sarah couldn't yet put into words. Her father's last words echoed in her mind. "You'll learn what happens to children who don't mind their elders. Stay here until I come back for you." The way he'd said it, with that cold edge in his voice she'd never heard before, made her stomach twist like a pretzel. Inside the cabin, Ezra McCallum sat at his rough-hewn table, staring at the steaming cup of coffee growing cold between his weathered hands. 20 years of solitude had taught him to listen to the mountain's rhythms. And something about this morning felt different, wrong, when he'd opened his door an hour ago to find the trembling child on his doorstep. Everything he'd worked to build in this isolated sanctuary had shifted like stones in an avalanche. The girl couldn't be more than 8 or 9, with auburn hair that caught the morning light and green eyes that held too much worry for someone so young. She reminded him of someone he'd once known, though the memory danced just beyond his reach, like smoke from a dying fire. Her clothes were well made but travel-worn, and she carried herself with the careful posture of a child who'd learned that making herself small might keep her safe. Ezra rose from his chair, his joints protesting after too many years of mountain winters and old wounds that never quite healed right. At 53, he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who'd learned that wasted motion could mean the difference between life and death. His beard had gone more grey than brown, and his hands bore the scars of both warfare and woodcraft. Most folks would have called him intimidating, but there was something about the lost child outside his door that stirred feelings he'd buried deeper than any grave. He opened the door slowly, not wanting to startle her more than she already was. Sarah turned toward him, and he saw tears tracking down her dirt-smudged cheeks. In that moment, she looked so much like Elena that his breath caught in his throat. Elena Whitmore, who'd been Elena Morrison when she was 17, and he was a young soldier about to ship out to Vietnam. Elena, who'd promised to wait for him, and had married another man while he was learning how to kill in foreign jungles. "Your father's not coming back today, child," Ezra said gently, though the words tasted bitter. He'd watched the man's wagon disappear down the mountain trail, with the kind of haste that spoke of relief rather than reluctance. "Might as well come inside where it's warm." Sarah's grip tightened on her doll, and she looked up at him with those devastating green eyes. "He said I was being punished for breaking Mama's china, but I didn't mean to." The wind caught the door, and it slammed and everything just fell. Her voice was small and careful, the way children sound when they've learned that grown-ups don't always listen to the whole story. Ezra's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough of the world to recognize cruelty dressed up as discipline, and abandoning a child in the wilderness crossed every line he'd ever held sacred. "Well, accidents happen," he said, stepping back to let her inside. And breaking dishes isn't a crime worth this kind of punishment. The cabin's interior was spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a few books arranged on a rough shelf beside it. The furniture looked handmade but sturdy, and everything had its place. Sarah noticed a wooden box sitting on the mantel, old and worn smooth by countless handlings. Something about it drew her attention, though she couldn't say why. "Are you hungry?" Ezra asked, moving toward the cast-iron stove where a pot of stew had been simmering since dawn. He'd learned long ago that feeding people was often the first step toward understanding them, and this child looked like she hadn't eaten properly in days. Sarah nodded hesitantly, then found her voice. "Yes, sir, but I don't have any money to pay you." The formality in her tone made Ezra's heart ache. No 8-year-old should sound so worried about economic transactions. "Money's not much use up here anyway," he said, ladling stew into a bowl. "The deer don't accept currency, and the mountains don't charge rent." As Sarah ate, her natural curiosity began to overcome her fear. She studied the cabin's contents with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. The books on the shelf were mostly about wildlife and survival, but there was also a volume of poetry and what looked like a military manual. The wooden box on the mantel seemed to call to her, though she was too well trained to touch things without permission. "What's in the box?" she asked finally, her spoon poised halfway to her mouth. Ezra followed her gaze and felt his chest tighten. The box contained his bronze star, his purple heart, and a few other reminders of a life he'd tried to leave behind. But it also held a photograph of Elena, taken when they were both young, and believed the world was full of endless possibilities. "Just some old memories," he said, which was both entirely true and completely inadequate. Nothing a young lady like yourself would find interesting, but Sarah was sharper than most adults gave her credit for. She'd spent her 8 years watching and listening, learning to read the spaces between words where the real truth often lived. "My mama used to have a box like that," she said softly. "She kept it hidden in her bedroom, and sometimes I'd catch her looking at the things inside when she thought nobody was watching. She'd get this sad smile, like she was remembering something beautiful that hurt." Ezra's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "Your mama's name was Elena, wasn't it?" Sarah's eyes widened. "How did you know that?" The question hung in the air like morning fog, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to explore. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and reminding them both. That winter was coming to the mountains with all its harsh certainties. Ezra walked to the window and looked out at the forest that had been both his prison and his sanctuary for 2 decades. Somewhere out there, a man had abandoned his daughter like unwanted cargo. And every instinct Ezra had developed during his years as a soldier told him there was more to this story than simple paternal cruelty. "I knew your mother a long time ago," he said finally, his voice rough with memories. "Before you were born, before she married your father." He turned back to Sarah, who was watching him with the kind of intensity that comes from finally hearing truth after a lifetime of careful half-truths. "She was the kindest person I've ever known, and if she was your mama, then you're welcome in this cabin for as long as you need to stay." Sarah's lower lip trembled, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of fear anymore. They were the complex tears of a child beginning to understand that the adult world was far more complicated than she'd ever imagined, and that sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones you needed protection from. As the afternoon wore on, Ezra showed Sarah around the cabin, explaining how the wood stove worked, where the extra blankets were stored, and how to work the hand pump for water. She absorbed everything with the quick intelligence of someone who'd learned early that knowledge could be the difference between safety and danger. "Will my father really come back?" she asked as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Ezra considered lying, considered offering false comfort the way adults often did with children. But there was something in Sarah's eyes that demanded honesty, even when the truth was hard to swallow. "I don't know," he said, "but I'll tell you what I do know. You're safe here, and you'll stay safe as long as I'm breathing. That's a promise. That night, as Sarah lay in the cabin's small spare room, clutching her cloth doll, she listened to the mountain sounds filtering through the walls. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate, and the wind sang lullabies through the pine boughs. For the first time since her father had driven away that morning, she felt something that might have been peace beginning to take root in her chest. In the main room, Ezra sat by the dying fire, staring at the wooden box on the mantel. Tomorrow, he would have to start making decisions about the child sleeping in his spare room. Tonight, though, he allowed himself to remember Elena Morrison as she'd been at 17, with auburn hair and green eyes and a laugh that could light up the darkest corners of a young soldier's heart. Some debts to the past, he reflected, came in forms you never expected. But they were debts just the same. 3 days passed before Sarah made the discovery that would change everything she thought she knew about her father and her abandonment. She had been helping Ezra with the morning chores, learning to split kindling with a hatchet almost as big as she was. When she noticed something white poking out from beneath the firewood her father had unloaded from his wagon. "Mr. Ezra," she called, using the formal address he'd gently corrected her to use, instead of just "Sir." "There's something stuck under here." Ezra looked up from where he was checking the cabin's storm shutters, preparing for the hard weather that the mountain's subtle signs promised was coming soon. The way the squirrels had been gathering nuts, the thickness of the horses' winter coats down in the valley, even the particular quality of light in the late afternoon, all of it spoke of a winter that would arrive early and stay late. Sarah tugged at the white object, and Ezra's blood ran cold as he recognized what she was pulling free. It was an envelope, expensive paper stock that had no business being in these mountains, and it was addressed to Thomas Whitmore in handwriting that looked more like a legal document than a friendly correspondence. "Give that here." "Oh, child," Ezra said, his voice carefully neutral. But Sarah had already torn it open with the natural curiosity of a child who'd spent too many years having information kept from her. Her face went pale as she read, and Ezra watched her green eyes grow wide with an understanding no 8-year-old should have to carry. The letter trembled in her small hands as she read it aloud, her voice getting smaller with each word. "Mr. Whitmore, your debt to our organization has reached critical status. The amount of $47,000, plus accumulated interest, represents a sum that requires immediate resolution. As discussed, alternative arrangements for payment have been agreed upon. The delivery of collateral as specified will satisfy the outstanding balance. Failure to complete this transaction by the agreed date will result in collection methods that extend beyond traditional financial remedies. Signed, Marcus Volkov." Ezra felt the old soldier's instincts he'd spent 20 years trying to bury surge back to life like a kicked hornet's nest. Volkov. He knew that name, though he wished to God he didn't. Marcus Volkov ran illegal gambling operations throughout Colorado and Wyoming, and his collection methods had earned him a reputation that made hardened criminals cross themselves when his name came up in conversation. "What does it mean?" Sarah asked, though her voice suggested she already understood more than she wanted to. "What's collateral?" Ezra's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He'd seen enough of the world's ugliness to recognize exactly what kind of transaction Thomas Whitmore had arranged with men like Volkov. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't been abandoned as punishment for breaking dishes. She'd been delivered like a piece of property to satisfy her father's gambling debts. "Sarah," he said gently, kneeling down to her level, "collateral means something valuable that someone gives as a promise to pay back money they owe. Like when someone borrows money to buy a house, the house becomes collateral." "But I'm not a house," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a person." The innocence in that statement broke something inside Ezra's chest. He'd spent 2 decades in these mountains trying to forget what human beings were capable of doing to each other. And now he was faced with evil, wearing the mask of paternal authority. "You're absolutely right," he said firmly. You are a person, and people are never collateral. What your father did is wrong, Sarah. Wrong and illegal, and something no parent should ever do to their child. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses' hooves echoed from the trail below the cabin. Ezra's military training kicked in immediately. Count the horses, assess the threat, identify escape routes. 3 horses, moving at a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. These weren't lost travelers or friendly visitors. "Sarah, I need you to go inside right now," Ezra said, his voice taking on the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Get under your bed and stay there until I come get you. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." "But what about now, Sarah?" She scrambled inside, and Ezra heard the soft thud of her body hitting the floor as she dove under the spare room bed. Good girl. Elena's daughter had inherited her mother's quick thinking, along with her eyes and hair. The 3 riders emerged from the tree line as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing. Ezra recognized the type immediately. City men trying to look like outdoorsmen, their clothes too new and their posture too rigid for people who belonged in these mountains. The leader was a thin man with pale eyes and the kind of stillness that spoke of controlled violence. "You, Ezra McCallum." The man called out, not bothering to dismount. "Depends who's asking," Ezra replied, letting his hands hang loose at his sides in a way that appeared relaxed, but put him within striking distance of the hunting knife on his belt. "Marcus Volkov sent us. We're here about a delivery that was supposed to be made." Ezra felt his jaw tighten. "Don't know anything about any delivery." The thin man smiled, and it was the kind of expression that had probably been the last thing many people saw. "Thomas Whitmore was supposed to leave his daughter here. Little girl, about 8 years old, red hair. We're here to collect her, mister," Ezra said, letting a hint of his old Arkansas drawl creep into his voice. "I've been living alone on this mountain for 20 years. Haven't seen hide nor hair of Thomas Whitmore or any little girl." It wasn't exactly a lie. He'd seen Thomas Whitmore for perhaps 5 minutes total, and most of that had been the man's back as he drove away. But Ezra had learned, during his years in Southeast Asia, that truth was often less important than survival. And right now survival meant keeping Sarah away from these men. The second rider, a heavy-set man with scars on his knuckles that spoke of a career in violence, shifted in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we should take a look around. Make sure he's telling the truth. That would be trespassing," Ezra said mildly. "And I'm not real hospitable to trespassers." The thin man's pale eyes studied Ezra with the kind of assessment predators make when deciding whether potential prey is worth the risk. What he saw was a man in his 50s, grey-bearded and weathered, wearing work clothes and carrying himself like someone accustomed to solitude. What he couldn't see was the bronze star hidden in the wooden box on the mantel, or the muscle memory of 100 night raids that lived in Ezra's hands and shoulders. "We'll be back," the thin man said finally. "Whitmore swore on his mother's grave that he left the girl here. If we find out you're lying, old man, this conversation won't be nearly so polite next time." They wheeled their horses around and disappeared back into the trees, but Ezra knew they wouldn't go far. Men like Volkov's enforcers didn't give up easily, and $47,000 was serious money. They'd be back with more men and less patience. Inside the cabin, Sarah emerged from under the bed like a small ghost, her face white with understanding that had aged her years in the space of minutes. "They came for me, didn't they?" she said. Ezra nodded grimly. "They did. And they'll be back." Sarah sank into one of the wooden chairs, still clutching the letter that had revealed her father's betrayal. "He sold me," she said, the words barely audible. "My own daddy sold me to pay for gambling." The devastation in her voice made Ezra want to track down Thomas Whitmore and show him exactly what 20 years of mountain living and military training had taught him about inflicting pain on people who deserved it. Instead, he knelt beside Sarah's chair and gently took the letter from her trembling hands. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "What your father did was unforgivable, but it doesn't define who you are or what your life will be." Those men think they can come up here and take you like you're a piece of furniture, but they're wrong. Dead wrong. But what can we do? Sarah asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. They'll keep coming back, and there's only one of you and lots of them. Ezra smiled, and for the first time since the riders had appeared, it was a genuine expression. Sarah, I spent 3 tours in Vietnam and another 10 years doing things for the government that I can't talk about even now. Those men down there think they're dangerous because they can intimidate shopkeepers and beat up people who can't fight back. They have no idea what real danger looks like. He stood and walked to the wooden box on the mantel, opening it for the first time since Sarah had arrived. Inside, nestled among his military decorations, was a photograph of Elena taken when she was 17. Sarah gasped when she saw it. That's my mama, she whispered. But she looks so young. She was young, Ezra said softly. We both were. I was about to ship out to Vietnam, and she promised to wait for me. He touched the photograph gently. She didn't wait, and I can't say I blame her. War changes people, and I came back different than I left. Is that why you live up here alone? Ezra nodded, partly. But maybe it's time for that to change. He looked down at Sarah, seeing Elena's courage in the set of her small jaw. Elena's intelligence, in the way she was already thinking ahead to the challenges they faced. Those men made a mistake today. They showed me exactly what your father did to you. And now I know what I'm fighting for. As night fell over the mountain, Ezra began making preparations that would have been familiar to any soldier who'd ever had to defend a position against superior numbers. He checked the cabin's sightlines, counted ammunition, and mentally catalogued every advantage the terrain might offer. Sarah watched him work with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. Are we going to fight them? If we have to, Ezra said. But first, we're going to make sure you're safe. And that means you're going to learn some things your father should have taught you but didn't that night. As Sarah lay in bed, listening to Ezra moving quietly around the cabin, securing windows and checking locks, she realized that her old life, the life where she trusted her father and believed that parents always protected their children, was gone forever. In its place was something harder and more complicated, but also something that felt more honest. Outside in the darkness, 3 men sat around a small campfire, planning their return visit to the cabin on the mountain. They had no way of knowing that the man they'd dismissed as an aging hermit was already 3 moves ahead of them, or that the child they thought of as property had inherited her mother's steel spine along with her green eyes. Winter was coming to the mountains, but the real storm was already here. Sarah discovered her mother's wedding ring on the 4th night after the men had come, and the finding of it felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave. She had been holding her cloth doll close in the darkness, seeking comfort from the familiar softness that had been her constant companion through every childhood fear and uncertainty. When her fingers detected something hard and small sewn into the doll's stuffing, working carefully by moonlight, filtering through the cabin's small window, she used her fingernails to pick at the tiny stitches until she could feel inside the doll's body. Her fingers closed around something circular and smooth, metal that had been warmed by years of being held close to the doll's cotton heart. When she pulled it free, even in the dim light, she recognized her mother's wedding ring. Not the simple gold band her father had insisted Elena wear after their marriage, but the delicate silver ring with tiny carved flowers that Elena had shown Sarah in secret, whispering that it had been a gift from someone special long before Sarah was born. "Mama hid this for me," Sarah whispered to the doll, understanding flooding through her with the clarity that sometimes comes to children in moments of profound discovery. Her mother had known something might happen, had prepared for the possibility that Sarah might need this connection to her past when everything else was taken away. She slipped the ring onto her thumb. It was far too large for her other fingers and felt something shift inside her chest. The ring carried weight beyond its silver, carried her mother's love and foresight and perhaps even approval for the path Sarah now found herself walking with the mountain man who had known Elena as a girl. In the main room, Ezra heard the soft sounds of Sarah moving around and recognized them as the restlessness of someone wrestling with thoughts too big for easy sleep. He'd been sitting by the dying fire, cleaning his old M1911 pistol with the methodical care of a man who understood that a weapon might be the difference between Sarah living and dying in the days to come. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly when she appeared in the doorway, still clutching her doll. Sarah shook her head and held out her hand, showing him the ring gleaming on her thumb. "I found this inside my doll. Mama must have put it there." Ezra's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the ring he'd saved. 3 months' worth of a private's pay to buy for Elena Morrison in 1972. He'd given it to her the night before he shipped out to Vietnam, along with a promise to come back and marry her properly when the war was over. She'd cried when she accepted it, not from happiness, but from some knowledge that even at 17 she'd possessed about the way the world worked and the promises it kept or broke. "She told me once that someone very special had given it to her," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from him. "Someone she cared about who went away to war." "That someone was me," Ezra said simply, setting down the pistol and looking at Sarah with eyes that held decades of regret and understanding. "I loved your mother very much, and she loved me. But war changed me, and when I came back, she'd already married your father and was expecting you." Sarah studied his face in the firelight, seeing the young soldier her mother had loved reflected in the weathered features of the man who was now protecting her. "Is that why you came to live up here? Because you were sad about losing her?" "Partly," Ezra admitted, "but also because the war taught me things about myself that I didn't much like. I'd gotten good at killing people, Sarah, too good. And when I came home, I found I didn't know how to be around folks who'd never had to do the things I'd done. But you're good with me," Sarah said with the directness children possess when they're trying to understand the adult world. "You've been kinder to me in 4 days than my father was in months before he left me here." Ezra felt his throat tighten. "That's because you're Elena's daughter, and because no child deserves what your father tried to do to you." The next morning, Ezra began teaching Sarah the skills she would need to survive in the mountains. But he approached the lessons with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge absorbed slowly was knowledge retained permanently. They started with the basics: how to identify edible plants, how to read weather signs in the behavior of animals, how to move through the forest without leaving obvious tracks. Sarah proved to be a quick learner, her natural intelligence sharpened by the understanding that these weren't games, but tools for survival. She listened with the intensity of someone whose life might depend on remembering every detail. And Ezra found himself impressed by her ability to ask the right questions and retain complex information. "Why do we walk on rocks when we can?" she asked as they practiced moving quietly through the forest behind the cabin. "Because rocks don't hold footprints the way soft earth does," Ezra explained. "And if those men come back with more friends, we don't want to make it easy for them to track us. Are we going to have to run away?" Ezra paused in his demonstration of how to step to avoid snapping twigs underfoot. "Maybe. Or maybe we'll make them decide that coming after us isn't worth the trouble. But either way, you need to know how to take care of yourself in these mountains." As the days passed, their relationship deepened in the way that happens when two people discover they can trust each other completely. Ezra found himself remembering how to be gentle without being weak, how to teach without being condescending, how to protect without being overprotective. Sarah, for her part, began to relax in ways she never had with her father, asking questions without fear of ridicule and making mistakes without fear of punishment. The ring on her thumb became a talisman, a physical reminder that her mother's love had transcended death and distance to provide exactly what Sarah needed when she needed it most. She would touch it during difficult moments, drawing strength from the connection to Elena and the knowledge that the man teaching her to survive had loved her mother with the kind of devotion that lasted decades beyond its breaking. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a day of practicing emergency procedures, Sarah asked the question that had been building in her mind since she'd found the ring. "If you loved my mama so much, and she loved you, why didn't you ever try to see her after she got married?" Ezra stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "Because she made her choice and it wasn't me. And because the man who came back from Vietnam wasn't the same man she'd fallen in love with. I didn't want her to see what I'd become, but what if she would have understood?" "Maybe she would have," Ezra said softly. "But I was too proud and too scared to find out. That's something I'll regret for the rest of my life." "Sarah, don't you make the same mistake when you're older. Don't let pride keep you from the people who matter." Outside the cabin, the first serious snow of the season began to fall. Large flakes that would accumulate into the kind of barrier that made mountain travel dangerous for anyone not prepared for winter's harsh realities. Inside, Sarah and Ezra continued their quiet conversation, building the foundation of trust and understanding that would sustain them through the trials ahead. Neither of them noticed the footprints in the fresh snow near the tree line, or the way the horses in the valley below had been spooked by unfamiliar scents. The men who had come for Sarah were still watching, still planning, but winter was changing the rules of engagement in ways that would favor the mountain man and the little girl who had inherited her mother's courage along with her ring. As Sarah drifted off to sleep that night, she touched the ring on her thumb and whispered a prayer of gratitude to the mother she missed every day. Elena had given her daughter more than jewelry. She had given her a connection to someone who would die before letting harm come to her, someone who carried Elena's memory like a sacred trust and would honor it by protecting the child she'd left behind. In the main room, Ezra sat cleaning his rifle and planning for possibilities he hoped would never come to pass. But for the first time in 20 years, he had something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. He had Elena's daughter to protect, and that made him feel more like the man he'd been before the war than anything had in 2 decades of mountain solitude. The weapons cache beneath the cabin's floorboards revealed itself to Sarah quite by accident. On a grey morning when she was helping Ezra with chores and dropped Elena's ring through a gap in the wooden planks. As she knelt to retrieve it, her small fingers encountered not dirt and rock as expected, but the smooth metal of something that definitely didn't belong in the natural foundation of a mountain cabin. "Mr. Ezra," she called, her voice carrying the particular note children use when they've discovered something significant. "There's something metal under here." Ezra looked up from where he'd been studying the tree line through the kitchen window, his attention sharpened by instincts that had kept him alive through 3 tours in hostile territory. For the past 2 days, he'd noticed small signs that they were being watched, broken branches at eye level that suggested someone had been using binoculars, disturbed snow patterns that indicated movement during the night hours when honest folks were asleep. He walked over to where Sarah knelt and saw immediately what had happened. The loose board that concealed his emergency supplies had shifted just enough to reveal a corner of the metal ammunition box he'd hoped never to need. In 20 years of mountain living, no one had ever discovered his hidden preparations. And now an 8-year-old girl had stumbled across them while looking for her mother's ring. "Sarah," he said gently, helping her to her feet and retrieving the ring from where it had fallen. "What you've found is something I hoped you'd never have to see. But given our circumstances, maybe it's time you understood what we're really dealing with." He pried up the loose floorboards, revealing a space that had been carefully excavated and lined with plastic sheeting to protect its contents from moisture. Inside were 3 rifles, 2 handguns, enough ammunition to outfit a small platoon, medical supplies that went far beyond basic first aid, and equipment that spoke of a man who'd learned to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Sarah stared at the cache with wide eyes, not frightened, but fascinated in the way children often are when adult secrets are finally revealed. "Is this why those men were afraid of you?" "They weren't afraid of me, Ezra corrected, lifting out one of the rifles to check its condition. They were being cautious because they don't know what they're dealing with. That's about to change. He'd spotted them again that morning. 3 men positioned at different points around the cabin's perimeter, moving with the kind of coordination that suggested military or law enforcement training. But their discipline was sloppy. They moved during daylight when they should have waited for darkness. And they'd chosen positions that offered good sight lines, but poor escape routes. "Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully," Ezra said, his voice taking on the tone he'd once used to brief soldiers before dangerous missions. "Those men who came looking for you, they're back, and this time they brought friends. We're going to have to defend ourselves. Are you going to kill them?" Sarah asked, her directness cutting straight to the heart of the moral complexity that Ezra had been wrestling with since the moment he'd realized what Thomas Whitmore had done to his daughter. "I'm going to protect you," Ezra said simply. "Whatever that requires." Over the next hour, he showed Sarah how the weapons worked, not because he wanted to turn a child into a soldier, but because knowledge might be the difference between her living and dying if something happened to him. She learned to load and unload the rifles, to distinguish between different types of ammunition, to understand the basic mechanics of firearms safety. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Sarah said as she practiced working the bolt action on an old hunting rifle that was almost as tall as she was. "Hurting people should never be something you want to do," Ezra agreed. "But sometimes good people have to do hard things to protect innocent folks. That's just the way the world works, and pretending otherwise doesn't make anyone safer." By midday, Ezra had confirmed what his instincts had been telling him. They were surrounded by at least 6 men who were positioning themselves for what looked like a coordinated assault on the cabin. Through his field glasses, he could see they were better armed and better organized than the 3 who'd come before. Volkov was taking the situation seriously now. "Why don't we just leave?" Sarah asked as they watched one of the men moving through the trees below the cabin. "We could go deeper into the mountains where they can't find us, because running would mean leaving everything behind and spending the winter in the wilderness with just what we can carry," Ezra explained. "And because men like this don't give up easily. They'd keep hunting us, and eventually they'd find us when we were cold and tired and unprepared. So we fight here. We make our stand here," Ezra corrected. "This cabin gives us advantages they can't match: thick walls, limited approaches, good sight lines, and supplies that will outlast theirs." As afternoon faded toward evening, Ezra put the final elements of his defensive plan into place. Sarah helped by memorizing the locations of emergency supplies, escape routes, and rally points, her quick mind absorbing tactical information with the same intensity she'd brought to learning about edible plants and weather patterns. "If something happens to me," Ezra said as they made their final preparations, "you know where the emergency packs are hidden, and you know the trail that leads to the ranger station 15 miles south. It's marked with yellow blazes on the trees. Nothing's going to happen to you," Sarah said with the fierce certainty of a child who'd already lost too many people she cared about. "Probably not," Ezra agreed. But soldiers always plan for contingencies. The attack came just after sunset, when the failing light would make accurate shooting difficult, but wouldn't yet require artificial illumination that might give away positions. Ezra had expected this timing. It was what he would have chosen if he'd been planning an assault on a defensive position. The first shots came from 3 different directions simultaneously, testing the cabin's defenses and trying to determine how many people were inside and how well they were armed. Ezra responded with carefully placed return fire that was designed more to communicate capability than to inflict casualties, though he made sure his shots came close enough to encourage respect for his marksmanship. "Stay low and stay quiet," he told Sarah, who had positioned herself in the corner of the main room, furthest from the windows, exactly as they'd practiced. "Let me handle this." The gunfight lasted less than 10 minutes, but it established several important facts for both sides. The attackers learned that the cabin contained at least one person with military-grade weapons and the skill to use them effectively. Ezra learned that he was facing professionals who would probe for weaknesses rather than relying on brute force assault. When the shooting stopped, an eerie quiet settled over the mountain clearing. Ezra kept his rifle trained on the most likely approach route, while Sarah remained perfectly still in her assigned position, both of them listening to the subtle sounds that might indicate movement in the darkness beyond the cabin walls. "McCallum," a voice called from the tree line. "Let's talk." "I'm listening," Ezra called back, not moving from his defensive position behind the overturned kitchen table. "You're outnumbered 6-1, and we've got enough ammunition to keep this up all night. Send out the girl, and we'll leave you in peace." "Counter-proposal," Ezra shouted back. "You pack up and head back to whatever city you crawled out of, and I won't start shooting to kill." The response was another volley of gunfire, this one more sustained and aggressive than the first. But Ezra had used the lull in combat to improve his position, and his return fire forced the attackers to take cover rather than maintaining their offensive pressure. As the second exchange of shots faded into mountain silence, Sarah looked up at Ezra from her corner and saw something in his face that she'd never seen in her father's: absolute determination to protect her no matter what it cost him. "Are you scared?" she whispered. "Terrified," Ezra admitted honestly, "but not of them. I'm scared of what happens to you if I fail." Outside in the darkness, 6 men settled in for what they now realized would be a longer siege than they'd planned. Inside the cabin, a grizzled mountain man and the daughter of the woman he'd loved, prepared for a fight that would determine whether Sarah Whitmore would grow up free or disappear into the kind of life that left no traces and answered to no laws. The ring on Sarah's thumb caught the firelight as she touched it for courage, and somewhere in the space between memory and hope, Elena Morrison smiled at the thought that her daughter had found her way to the one man in the world who would die before letting harm come to her. The burned photograph revealed itself in the cold ashes of the fireplace 3 days after the first gunfight, and its discovery would force Sarah to confront truths about her family that she'd never imagined possible. She'd been cleaning the fireplace as part of her morning chores when her small fingers encountered something that felt different from the usual: debris of burned logs and paper, something with the stiff texture of photographic paper that had been partially consumed by flames. Working carefully to avoid tearing the fragile remnant, she extracted what remained of a family photograph. She could see herself at perhaps 6 years old, standing between her parents in what looked like their backyard in Denver. Her mother's image was intact, showing Elena's gentle smile and the way she'd always placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. But her father's face had been deliberately burned away, the flames eating through the paper in a pattern too precise to be accidental. "Mr. Ezra," Sarah called softly, her voice carrying the weight of a discovery that felt both significant and troubling. Ezra looked up from where he'd been reinforcing the cabin's window shutters with additional boards, preparing for the siege he knew was coming. The men in the forest had pulled back after the gunfight, but they hadn't left. His morning reconnaissance had revealed at least 8 people now positioned around the cabin's perimeter, and someone with resources was coordinating their movements. When he saw what Sarah held in her hands, his expression grew grim. He recognized the photograph immediately. It was one he'd burned in a moment of anger years ago when he'd finally learned that Elena had died in a car accident while he was still too proud and too wounded to reach out to her. "Where did you find that?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "In the fireplace," Sarah said, studying the image with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Someone burned Daddy's face out of it, but they kept the part with me and Mama." Ezra sank into his chair, the weight of old secrets and difficult truths pressing down on him like the mountain snow that was beginning to accumulate outside the cabin. He'd hoped to protect Sarah from the more complex aspects of the adult world for a while longer, but circumstances were forcing his hand. "I burned that picture," he admitted. About 5 years ago, when I learned that your mother had died, Sarah's green eyes widened with understanding. You knew Mama was dead, but you never tried to find me. I didn't know you existed until you showed up on my doorstep, Ezra said honestly. Your mother and I lost touch after she married your father. I didn't even know she'd had a child. But if you loved her so much, why didn't you at least try to stay in contact? The question cut to the heart of regrets that Ezra had been carrying for decades. He looked at Sarah, Elena's daughter, with her mother's eyes and her mother's courage, and realized that some truths were too important to soften with comfortable lies. Because I was angry, he said simply. Angry that she'd married someone else. Angry that the war had changed me. Angry at the world for not being the way I wanted it to be. So I came up here and spent 20 years being a bitter old man instead of dealing with my feelings like a grown-up should. Sarah studied the photograph again, running her finger along the burned edge where her father's face had been. Why did you burn his part out but not ours? Because even though I was angry, I could never bring myself to destroy the image of your mother. And you, he paused, struggling with emotions he'd kept buried for decades. You were part of her, and that made you sacred to me even before I knew you. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices carrying across the clearing. Ezra moved to the window and peered through a gap in the boards, his military training automatically assessing the new development. 2 more vehicles had arrived during their conversation, bringing what looked like additional personnel and equipment. They're not giving up, Sarah observed, joining him at the window despite his gesture for her to stay back. No, they're not. And that tells me this isn't just about collecting a debt anymore. Someone's made this personal. As if to underscore his point, a voice called out from the tree line, not one of the men who'd been there before, but someone new, someone with authority. McCallum! I want to talk. Ezra recognized the voice immediately, though he hadn't heard it in over 20 years. Marcus Volkov himself had come to the mountain, which meant the stakes had escalated far beyond what Ezra had originally calculated. Sarah, get to your position, Ezra said quietly. This is about to get complicated. He opened the door just far enough to make his voice carry without exposing himself to sniper fire. I'm listening, Volkov. You know who I am. Good. That should make this easier. Volkov's accent carried traces of Eastern Europe overlaid with decades of American urban living. I want the girl, and I want her alive and undamaged. In exchange, I'll make sure you die quickly instead of slowly. Counteroffer, Ezra called back. You pack up your collection of urban predators and head back to whatever city you crawled out of. And I won't start reducing their numbers permanently. The response came in the form of laughter that carried no warmth whatsoever. You think you're dealing with street thugs, old man? I've got 12 professionals out here and winter's coming. How long do you think your food will last? How long before that little girl gets tired of being trapped in a cabin with a crazy hermit? Ezra didn't respond immediately, instead using the time to count muzzle flashes he could see positioned around the clearing. Volkov wasn't lying about the numbers. They were seriously outnumbered, and the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. What makes her so valuable? Ezra finally called out. $47,000 is a lot of money, but you're spending more than that just keeping all these people here. That's not your concern, McCallum. Your concern should be making this easy on yourself and the girl. But Sarah, listening from her position in the corner, felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to click into place in her mind. She remembered conversations she'd overheard between her parents, arguments that had seemed meaningless at the time, but now carried new significance. Her father hadn't just been gambling. He'd been gambling with people who had connections to things far more dangerous than simple debt collection. Mr. Ezra, she whispered urgently, I think I know why they want me so badly. Ezra moved away from the door, keeping his rifle ready while listening to what Sarah had realized. My mama had a safety deposit box, Sarah said quietly. She thought I didn't know about it, but I saw her go there sometimes when Daddy was at work. She'd come back looking worried, like she was trying to figure out what to do about something important. What does that have to do with... The ring, Sarah interrupted. holding up her thumb, where Elena's silver band gleamed in the firelight. What if it's not just a ring? What if Mama hid something else, something that could get these people in trouble? Ezra felt his blood run cold as the implications hit him. If Elena had somehow obtained evidence of Volkov's operations, bank records, transaction details, photographs, and if that evidence was hidden somewhere only Sarah could access, then the girl wasn't just collateral for her father's debts. She was the key to information that could destroy one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the Rocky Mountain region. Sarah, think carefully. Did your mother ever say anything about keeping secrets safe? About protecting you from something? Sarah closed her eyes, trying to remember conversations that had seemed like meaningless adult talk at the time. Slowly, fragments began to surface. Her mother's quiet voice talking about insurance policies and making sure Sarah would be taken care of no matter what happened. She used to say that someday I might need to be brave and remember where she kept the important papers, Sarah said slowly. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should look for the place where the flowers never die. Ezra's military mind immediately began processing this new information and its tactical implications. If Sarah possessed the key to evidence that could bring down Volkov's organization, then the crime boss had no choice but to recover her regardless of cost. And if he couldn't get her alive, he'd certainly want her dead to prevent the evidence from ever surfacing. The flowers never die, Ezra repeated. Does that mean anything specific to you? There was a place Mama used to take me sometimes, a cemetery where she'd visit her grandmother's grave. The flowers there were made of metal and stone. They never died because they weren't really alive. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that was far more complex and dangerous than a simple gambling debt. Elena had somehow obtained evidence of Volkov's criminal activities, probably through her husband's involvement with illegal gambling operations. She'd hidden that evidence and given her daughter the clues necessary to find it, creating an insurance policy that would protect Sarah if anything happened to her. But Thomas Whitmore, desperate to pay his debts and probably unaware of what his wife had been doing, had delivered Sarah directly to the people she possessed evidence against. It was a betrayal so complete and so devastating that Ezra felt his hands shake with the desire to find Thomas Whitmore and exact the kind of justice that left permanent marks. We need to get you out of here, Ezra said grimly. If I'm right about what your mother did, these people will never stop hunting you. Not until they get whatever evidence she collected. But where can we go? They'll just follow us. Maybe. But first we have to survive long enough to worry about running. Ezra moved back to the window and peered out at the positions he could identify in the growing darkness. Sarah, I need you to understand something. These people aren't going to give up and go home. This is going to end with either them dead or us dead. And I'd prefer it be them. As night fell over the mountain clearing, the temperature dropped and the snow began falling more heavily, creating conditions that would test everyone's endurance and resolve. Inside the cabin, a grizzled former soldier and the daughter of the woman he'd loved prepared for a siege that would determine whether evidence of decades-old crimes would ever see the light of day. Outside in the darkness, Marcus Volkov settled in for what he knew might be a long wait. He had resources, patience, and the absolute determination of a man who understood that failure to recover or eliminate Sarah Whitmore would mean the end of everything. He'd built over 30 years of careful criminal enterprise. The burned photograph lay on the cabin's table, its damaged surface reflecting the firelight, like a promise that some secrets were worth dying to protect, and some betrayals demanded a reckoning that could only be paid in blood. The ledger that would reveal the true scope of Thomas Whitmore's betrayal lay hidden beneath Sarah's mattress in the cabin's spare room, and she discovered it purely by accident when a loose floorboard shifted under the bed's weight during her restless sleep. Sarah had been tossing and turning, plagued by nightmares about her father's face dissolving into smoke, when she felt the mattress dip in a way that suggested something solid beneath it, working quietly so as not to wake Ezra. who had been taking turns sleeping and maintaining watch throughout the siege's third night. Sarah slipped her hand between the mattress and the wooden bed frame. Her fingers encountered a leather-bound book that felt substantial and important, with the weight of something that contained secrets too dangerous for casual discovery. By lamplight, she opened what proved to be her father's private ledger, a detailed record of gambling debts, criminal associations, and financial transactions that painted a picture of Thomas Whitmore as far more than a man who'd simply gotten in over his head at poker tables. The entries, written in her father's careful handwriting, documented years of deliberate involvement with Marcus Volkov's organization. The numbers were staggering. Her father hadn't accumulated $47,000 in gambling debts over a few months of bad luck. He'd been laundering money for Volkov's criminal enterprise for over 3 years, taking percentages that had grown into a substantial personal fortune. But somewhere along the line, Thomas had gotten greedy or careless, and money that belonged to dangerous people had ended up in his own accounts. More devastating than the financial details were the personal entries scattered throughout the ledger. Her father had written about Elena's growing suspicions, about her threats to take Sarah and leave if he didn't extract himself from his criminal associations. He documented his wife's discovery of his activities, and her promise to gather evidence that would destroy both him and Volkov if anything happened to her, or, "Sarah, that stupid woman thinks she can threaten me," one entry read, dated just 2 months before Elena's car accident. "She doesn't understand that these people don't negotiate with wives who know too much. If she pushes this any further, she'll learn exactly how dangerous it is to interfere with business that doesn't concern her." Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis as the implications of what she was reading became clear. Her mother's death hadn't been an accident at all. It had been arranged by her own husband, working in coordination with the criminal organization that was now besieging the mountain cabin. "Mr. Ezra," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying enough urgency to wake him from his light doze in the chair beside the window. Ezra came alert immediately, his hand moving to the rifle beside his chair before he fully registered that the threat was informational rather than physical. "What is it, Sarah?" She held out the ledger with trembling hands, unable to speak the words that would make her father's betrayal real and complete. Ezra took the book and began reading by lamplight, his expression growing harder with each page until his face resembled carved granite. "My God," he breathed, understanding the full scope of what Elena had been dealing with in the months before her death. "Sarah, your mother was trying to protect you from all this. She knew what your father had become, and she was gathering evidence to stop him. He killed her, didn't he?" Sarah asked, the words barely more than a whisper. "My own daddy murdered my mama." Ezra set the ledger aside and knelt beside Sarah's chair, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "It looks that way, child. I'm sorry you had to learn this, but you needed to know what we're really fighting against." The emotional impact of the revelation was devastating, but Sarah had inherited Elena's steel spine along with her green eyes. Instead of collapsing under the weight of betrayal and grief, she felt something hardening inside her chest, a determination that felt adult and absolute. "They're not getting away with this," she said quietly, her voice carrying a resolve that would have made her mother proud. "Mama died trying to protect me, and I'm not going to let that be for nothing." Ezra studied her face in the lamplight and saw the transformation that sometimes happens when children are forced to grow up too quickly. The scared 8-year-old who'd been abandoned at his doorstep was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true nature of the world and was prepared to fight for justice, regardless of the personal cost. "Sarah, what your father did was unforgivable, but you're still just a child. You don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "These people killed my mama and tried to sell me like I was property. Someone has to make them pay for that." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of movement outside the cabin, not the careful positioning of snipers or the tactical repositioning of assault teams, but the regular activity of people setting up a more permanent encampment. Through gaps in the boarded windows, they could see the glow of campfires and hear the low murmur of voices planning something more complex than a simple assault. Ezra moved to his observation position and used his field glasses to assess the new developments. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Volkov was settling in for an extended siege, complete with supply lines and reinforcement schedules that suggested he was prepared to wait weeks if necessary. "They're not planning to storm the cabin," Ezra reported grimly. "They're going to starve us out. How long can we last? With careful rationing, maybe 3 weeks. But that assumes they don't find a way to cut off our water supply or burn us out." Sarah moved to the window and studied the enemy positions with the analytical intensity she'd inherited from her mother. "What if we don't wait for them to starve us out? What if we go on the attack instead?" Ezra looked at her with surprise and growing respect. "Sarah, there are at least 12 of them out there, and they're professionals. Even with military training and good defensive positions, those aren't odds that favor survival. But they're not expecting us to attack, are they? They think we're trapped in here, scared and waiting for rescue that isn't coming." She was right, and Ezra felt his tactical thinking shift to accommodate possibilities he hadn't previously considered. His military experience had taught him that sometimes the most desperate situations required the most audacious responses. And there was something appealing about taking the fight to people who thought they had him cornered, even if we could somehow reduce their numbers. Ezra said carefully, "We'd still need somewhere to go afterward. They've probably got people watching every trail down the mountain. Then we don't go down the mountain. We go up." Ezra frowned, not understanding her logic. "Sarah, there's nothing up there but wilderness. No roads, no towns, no help. But there's the old mining camp," Sarah said, remembering stories her mother had told about the area's history. "Mama used to talk about the silver mines that operated up here in the 1800s. She said some of the tunnels go for miles underground, connecting different parts of the mountain. The idea was audacious enough to have potential. If the old mining tunnels were still accessible, they could provide both shelter and concealment, while offering multiple exit routes that would be impossible for Volkov's people to cover effectively. But it would also mean abandoning the cabin's defensive advantages and venturing into underground passages that might be structurally unsound after more than a century of neglect. "It's dangerous," Ezra said, thinking through the tactical implications. "Those tunnels could have cave-ins, bad air, flooding, but it's better than sitting here waiting to die," Sarah interrupted. "And if Mama was right about the evidence she hid, we need to live long enough to make sure it gets to people who can use it." As dawn approached over the besieged mountain cabin, Ezra found himself considering a plan that was equal parts military tactics and childhood adventure story. The ledger had revealed the true stakes of their situation. This wasn't just about Sarah's safety anymore, but about justice for Elena and accountability for crimes that had gone unpunished for years. Outside, in the growing light, Marcus Volkov's men maintained their positions with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Inside the cabin, a former soldier and the daughter of his lost love prepared for a gamble that would either lead to freedom or result in their deaths in the abandoned tunnels beneath the Colorado mountains. The ledger lay open on the table, its pages documenting betrayals that demanded a reckoning and secrets that were worth any risk to preserve. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, Sarah Whitmore was determined that her mother's sacrifice would not be in vain, and that the men responsible for Elena's death would face the consequences of their crimes. The blood-stained map that would change everything lay hidden behind a false panel in Ezra's bedroom, and Sarah discovered it while searching for additional ammunition during what they both knew might be their final hours in the cabin. She had been methodically checking every hiding place Ezra had shown her, preparing for their desperate escape attempt through the mountain tunnels, when her fingers found the panel that seemed slightly different from the surrounding wood. The map, when she finally worked it free, was hand-drawn on surveyor's paper and marked with dates spanning nearly 2 decades. But what made Sarah's breath catch in her throat were the rust-colored stains scattered across its surface. Stains that could only be blood, and locations marked with small crosses that looked disturbingly like grave markers. "Mr. Ezra," she called softly, her voice carrying a note of discovery that brought him immediately to her side. When Ezra saw what she'd found, his face went ashen. This was the map he'd hoped never to need, the record of secrets he'd planned to take to his grave. But circumstances had moved beyond his control, and the time for protecting Sarah from difficult truths had passed. "Sarah, there are things about why I came to this mountain that I never intended to tell you," he said heavily, taking the map from her trembling hands. "Things that your mother knew but never understood the full scope of." The map detailed the location of something called the Elena Mine, named, Sarah realized with growing shock, after her mother. But the crosses scattered across its surface told a story far darker than simple mining operations. "This isn't just about gold, is it?" Sarah asked, studying the careful notations that covered the map's surface. "No," Ezra admitted, sinking into his chair like a man carrying weight too heavy for his shoulders. "It's about justice, and about crimes that powerful people thought they could bury in these mountains." The truth came out slowly, each revelation more shocking than the last. 20 years ago, Ezra hadn't come to the mountain seeking solitude after Vietnam. He'd come as part of a covert government operation to investigate the disappearance of federal witnesses who'd been scheduled to testify against organized crime figures, including Marcus Volkov. "The Elena Mine isn't a gold mine," Ezra explained, his voice heavy with decades of guilt and regret. "It's where they buried the people who tried to stand up to criminals like Volkov. Witnesses, investigators, family members who asked too many questions. Over the years, I found 17 bodies in those tunnels." Sarah felt her world shift again as the implications became clear. And Mama knew about this. Your mother stumbled across evidence of what was happening when she was researching your father's gambling connections. She came to me about 6 months before she died, asking questions about things she'd discovered. I tried to warn her away, but she was determined to protect you from what your father had become involved with. The map showed not just the location of the mine, but detailed records of every person who'd been murdered and buried there. Names, dates, circumstances of death. It was evidence that could bring down not just Volkov's organization, but corrupt officials who'd been covering up the murders for decades. "This is what they're really after," Sarah said with the clarity that sometimes comes to children when adults try to overcomplicate simple truths. "They don't just want to stop Mama's evidence from coming out. They want this map because it proves they've been killing people for 20 years. Ezra nodded grimly. "And if they get their hands on it, those 17 people will stay buried forever, and their families will never know what happened to them." But Sarah was already thinking beyond the immediate implications, her mind working through possibilities with the strategic intelligence she'd inherited from both her parents. Elena's moral courage, and even Thomas's calculating mind, turned now toward justice instead of profit. "What if we don't run?" she said slowly. "What if we use this to force them to come to us?" "Sarah, there are 12 armed men out there, but they don't know we have this map," she interrupted, her green eyes bright with an idea that was taking shape with frightening clarity. "They think we're just trying to stay alive. What if we let them think they're winning, let them get close enough to what?" "Sarah, you're talking about something that could get us both killed. We're probably going to die anyway," she said, with the stark realism of someone who'd learned too much about adult betrayals in too short a time. "But if we die, at least we can make sure this evidence survives. And if we live, we can make sure all those people get justice." As dawn approached, Sarah outlined a plan that was part military strategy and part moral reckoning. Instead of fleeing through the mining tunnels, they would use the tunnels as a trap, luring Volkov's men into the underground passages where superior numbers would be less advantageous and where the physical evidence of decades of murders would be impossible to deny. "You want to turn the mine into a battlefield," Ezra said. understanding the tactical implications of what she was proposing. "I want to turn it into a courtroom," Sarah corrected. "A place where the truth comes out and people have to face what they've done." It was audacious, dangerous, and probably suicidal. It was also, Ezra realized, exactly what Elena would have wanted her daughter to do: fight for justice regardless of the personal cost, and make sure that evil didn't triumph simply because good people were too frightened to take risks. "Your mother would be proud of you," Ezra said softly, studying Sarah's face and seeing Elena's courage reflected in features that were growing more adult by the hour. "Then, let's make sure she gets to be proud," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the kind of determination that had once made her mother willing to face down criminals and corrupt officials in defense of what was right. Outside the cabin, Marcus Volkov's men maintained their positions, confident that time and winter would eventually force their quarry into surrender or desperation. They had no way of knowing that inside the besieged cabin, the targets were preparing not to flee but to strike back with evidence that would expose crimes reaching back 2 decades and reaching into levels of government and law enforcement they'd thought were safely beyond accountability. The blood-stained map lay on the table between them, its markings a testament to injustices that had gone unpunished for too long. In a few hours, those stains would either be joined by fresh blood as Sarah and Ezra made their final stand, or they would become the foundation for a reckoning that would bring justice to the 17 people who died for trying to do what was right. The Elena mine was about to live, up to its name in ways that Marcus Volkov and his organization could never have anticipated. And the little girl who'd been abandoned as payment for gambling debts was preparing to collect a very different kind of debt, one measured in justice rather than money, and one that demanded payment in truth rather than blood. Winter was coming to the mountains, but the real storm was about to break underground, in tunnels where secrets had been buried for decades, and where Sarah Whitmore was determined to make sure they finally saw the light. Ezra's war journal revealed itself to Sarah as both tactical manual and emotional confession when she discovered it in his pack while preparing for what they both understood might be their final battle. The leather-bound notebook contained 20 years of detailed observations about the mountain, the mine, and the ghosts of decisions that had shaped every day of his self-imposed exile. "I kept records of everything," Ezra explained as Sarah read entries that documented not just the physical evidence of murders he'd discovered, but the psychological toll of carrying such knowledge alone. "Every body I found, every piece of evidence I recovered, every time I failed to save someone who might still be alive if I'd acted faster or smarter." The journal entries painted a picture of a man, haunted by precision, a former soldier, who'd applied military discipline to the investigation of crimes that law enforcement had either ignored or actively covered up. But between the tactical observations and evidence catalogues were personal reflections that revealed the emotional cost of his 20-year mission. September 15, 2019, found what's left of Maria Santos, the accountant who was going to testify about Volkov's money laundering. Been dead maybe 6 months. Her family still thinks she ran off with a boyfriend. How do I tell them their daughter died trying to do the right thing? March 22nd, 2021. Elena came to see me today. She's figured out more than I hoped anyone would. I tried to scare her away from this, but she has that look in her eyes, the same one she had when we were kids, and she decided something was worth fighting for. I'm terrified she's going to end up like the others. June 8th, 2021. Elena's dead. Car accident, they're calling it. But I know what accidents look like and what murder looks like. Thomas delivered his own wife to them, and now I have to live with the knowledge that I could have prevented this if I'd trusted her enough to tell her the whole truth. Sarah read each entry with growing understanding of the weight Ezra had been carrying, and the way her mother's death had nearly broken him completely. But she also saw something else in the journal's pages, detailed tactical plans for scenarios very much like the one they now faced. "You've been preparing for this for years," she said, studying diagrams that showed every tunnel entrance, every defensive position, every possible escape route in the mine complex. "I've been preparing for the day when I'd have to make a stand," Ezra admitted. "I just never thought it would be to protect Elena's daughter." The final preparations took most of the day, with Sarah proving herself invaluable in ways that would have amazed adults who still thought of her as simply a frightened child. She memorized tunnel maps with the precision of someone whose life depended on perfect recall, learned to operate communication equipment that would let them coordinate their defense, and absorbed tactical information with the focus of a natural strategist. "If we get separated in the tunnels," Ezra said, "going through the emergency procedures one final time, you know the rally points, you know the escape routes, and you know where the evidence caches are hidden. We're not going to get separated," Sarah said with the absolute certainty of someone who decided that some outcomes were simply unacceptable. As afternoon faded toward evening, they could see increased activity in Volkov's camp. Men were checking equipment, cleaning weapons, and moving with the purposeful energy of people preparing for action. The siege was about to enter its final phase. "They're going to try a night assault," Ezra observed, watching the preparations through his field glasses. "Probably thinking we'll be tired and disoriented after days of being trapped in here." "Let them come," Sarah said, her voice carrying a hardness that would have broken her mother's heart, even as it made Elena proud. "We'll be ready." The plan they'd developed was complex but achievable, requiring precise timing and absolute trust between them. They would abandon the cabin just before the assault began, using the tunnel system to position themselves where they could control the battlefield, while ensuring that Volkov's men would be forced to confront the physical evidence of their crimes. "Sarah, you understand that once we start this, there's no going back," Ezra said as they made final checks of their equipment. "Win or lose, after tonight everything changes." "Everything already changed the day Daddy drove away and left me here," Sarah replied. "Tonight, we just make it official." As darkness settled over the mountain, they could hear Volkov's men moving into position for what they clearly intended to be the final assault on the cabin. Voices carried across the clearing as team leaders coordinated their approach, and the confident tone suggested they expected minimal resistance from a tired old man and a frightened child. "Time to go," Ezra said, shouldering his pack and checking his weapons one last time. They slipped out of the cabin through the root cellar, using a tunnel Ezra had dug years ago as an emergency escape route. The passage led directly into the old mining complex, bypassing all the observation positions Volkov's men had established around the cabin's perimeter. As they moved through the underground passages, Sarah felt the weight of history surrounding them. These tunnels had witnessed decades of injustice, people murdered for trying to do what was right, families destroyed by corruption, truth buried as deep as the bodies that lay in unmarked graves throughout the mine complex. "This is where it ends," she whispered as they reached the central chamber where Ezra had been, storing evidence for 20 years. The chamber was larger than Sarah had imagined, with multiple tunnels branching off in different directions and evidence lockers built into the rock walls. But what dominated the space were the graves, 17 carefully marked burial sites where Ezra had laid to rest the victims of crimes that powerful people had thought would never be discovered. Every one of these people died because they believed truth was more important than safety, Ezra said quietly, gesturing toward the graves. "Tonight, we find out if they were right." Above them, they could hear the sound of the assault beginning as Volkov's men stormed the empty cabin. It would take them several minutes to realize their targets had vanished, and several more to discover the tunnel entrance that would lead them underground. "Positions," Ezra said, and Sarah moved to the communication station they'd established earlier, ready to coordinate their defense of the underground complex. The final battle was about to begin, not just for their lives, but for the memory of everyone who died in these tunnels, and for the principle that justice delayed shouldn't mean justice denied. In the darkness of the Elena mine, surrounded by the graves of people who died for trying to do what was right, an 8-year-old girl and a haunted former soldier prepared to make their stand against evil that had operated with impunity for far too long. The journal lay open beside Sarah's communication equipment, its pages documenting 2 decades of pain and preparation. Tonight, those preparations would be tested in ways that would determine whether Ezra's vigil had been meaningful sacrifice or tragic waste. But Sarah felt no doubt about the outcome. She had her mother's ring on her thumb, her mother's courage in her heart, and her mother's sense of justice guiding her decisions. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, Elena Whitmore's daughter was determined that the truth would finally see the light, even if that light had to shine in the darkness of an abandoned mine where 17 people waited for their stories to be told. Sarah's mother's locket revealed its final secret in the moments before the underground battle began, and the key it contained would prove to be as important as any weapon in determining the outcome of their desperate fight for justice. Sarah had been checking her equipment one final time when her fingers found the catch she'd never noticed before. A tiny mechanism that opened the locket to reveal not just Elena's photograph, but a small brass key tucked behind it. "Mr. Ezra," she whispered urgently, showing him the key as the sound of men entering the tunnel system echoed from the passages above them. Ezra recognized the key immediately. It was the type used for safety deposit boxes, and its presence in Elena's locket confirmed what they'd suspected about her preparations for protecting her daughter. But there was no time to discuss implications, as the tactical situation demanded immediate attention. "They're in the tunnels," Ezra reported, listening to the voices that carried through the mine's acoustic properties with disturbing clarity. "At least 8 men, moving in 2 teams. Can we contain them in the main passage?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "For a while. But eventually, they'll figure out the tunnel layout and start flanking us." Ezra made final adjustments to the explosive charges he'd positioned at key choke points throughout the mine. "Sarah, are you absolutely certain about this? Once shooting starts, there won't be any opportunity to change your mind." "I'm certain," she said, her green eyes reflecting the lamplight with an intensity that reminded Ezra powerfully of Eleanor at her most determined. "These people killed my mother and tried to sell me like property. Someone has to make them pay." The first exchange of gunfire came sooner than expected, as Volkov's advance team encountered the defensive positions Ezra had prepared in the mine's upper levels. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the tunnels with deafening intensity, but the acoustic properties that made communication difficult also made it hard for the attackers to coordinate their movements effectively. "First team is pinned down in Tunnel 3. Sarah reported from her position at the communications equipment, monitoring radio chatter she'd learned to intercept. "Second team is trying to find an alternate route through the lower passages." "Let them come," Ezra said grimly, checking his rifle and moving to a firing position that covered the main approach to the evidence chamber. "The deeper they get into this maze, the more advantages shift to our side." But the battle wasn't going entirely according to plan. Volkov's men were better trained and better equipped than Ezra had anticipated, and they were adapting to the tunnel environment faster than he'd hoped. Worse, their radio communications indicated they had detailed maps of the mine complex, information that should have been impossible for them to obtain. "How do they know about the lower tunnels?" Sarah asked, studying the tactical display Ezra had created to track enemy movements. "Someone told them," Ezra said grimly. "Someone who's been here before." The answer came in the form of a familiar voice echoing from the tunnel entrance. Thomas. Whitmore calling out to his daughter with words that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Sarah, I know you're down there. I've come to take you home." The betrayal was complete now. Not only had Thomas delivered his daughter to criminals and arranged his wife's murder, but he was actively helping those same criminals hunt Sarah through the tunnels where evidence of their crimes lay buried. "Daddy sold us out," Sarah said, her voice carrying a flatness that spoke of emotions too complex for tears. He gave them maps of the mine. "Sarah, you need to understand something," Thomas's voice continued, getting closer as he moved deeper into the tunnel system. "These people aren't going to let any of us live if they don't get what they want. Your mother's evidence, whatever she hid, it's not worth dying for." "It was worth her dying for," Sarah called back, her young voice carrying clearly through the mine's acoustics. "Oh, and it's worth you dying for, too." The words hung in the air like a judgment, and Ezra saw something in Sarah's expression that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The moment when a child finally understands that some adults can't be redeemed, and that justice sometimes requires standing against the very people who should have protected you. "Sarah." "Please," Thomas called, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm your father. I love you." "You killed my mother," Sarah responded, her voice echoing off the tunnel walls with perfect clarity. The dynamite cache that would determine the final outcome of their desperate battle lay hidden in the deepest part of the Elena mine, and Ezra's decision to use it would require a sacrifice that would test everything he'd learned about love, loss, and the true meaning of protecting someone you care about. The explosive charges had been his. Insurance policy for 20 years, enough firepower to collapse the entire mine complex and bury its secrets forever. If he was ever forced to choose between exposure and elimination, "Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully," Ezra said, as the sound of Volkov's final assault grew closer, echoing through the tunnels with the intensity of men who knew this was their last chance to prevent decades of crimes from seeing daylight. "There's a passage behind the evidence lockers that leads to an old air shaft. It comes out about half a mile down the mountain, near the ranger station trail. I'm not leaving you," Sarah said with the absolute certainty of someone who'd already lost too many people she cared about. "You're not leaving me. You're completing the mission." Ezra's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent his adult life making impossible decisions in life-or-death situations. "Someone has to survive to make sure your mother's evidence reaches people who can use it. Someone has to tell the story of the people buried in these tunnels." The sound of explosions and automatic weapons fire was getting closer now, punctuated by Volkov's voice shouting orders that made it clear he was willing to bring down the entire mountain rather than let Sarah escape with information that could destroy his organization. "The safety deposit box key," Sarah said, understanding the tactical reality even as her heart rebelled against it. "Even if they kill us both, someone else can use it to access Mama's evidence." "That's right. But they have to know the key exists, and they have to know where to find it." Ezra moved to the dynamite cache, his hands working with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades preparing for this moment. "Sarah, I'm going to create a distraction that will give you time to reach the air shaft. When you get to the ranger station, you tell them about Box 247 at First National Bank in Denver. You tell them about the 17 people buried in this mine. You tell them everything." Before Sarah could protest further, the evidence chamber erupted in chaos as Volkov's assault team broke through Ezra's final defensive line. 6 men in tactical gear poured into the chamber, their weapons trained on the positions where they expected to find their targets cornered and helpless. What they found instead was Ezra McCallum standing in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the graves of their victims, holding a detonator that was connected to enough explosive to turn the entire mine complex into a crater. "Gentlemen," Ezra said conversationally, his voice carrying the calm of someone who'd made peace with impossible choices, "I believe you're looking for something that belongs to this little girl." Sarah had moved to the concealed passage, but she hadn't entered it. Instead, she stood where Volkov's men could see her, her mother's locket gleaming in the lamplight, and her green eyes reflecting a determination that would have made Elena proud. "The key you want is in this locket," she said clearly, her young voice carrying through the chamber with perfect clarity. "The key that opens the safety deposit box where my mama hid all the evidence about your crimes." Volkov himself appeared in the chamber entrance, his pale eyes taking in the tactical situation with the assessment of someone who'd built a criminal empire by understanding when to fight and when to negotiate. Miss Whitmore, he said with the kind of politeness that made his threats more frightening than shouting would have been. You're a very brave little girl, but this doesn't have to end with anyone else dying. Give me the key and I'll make sure you're taken care of. The way you took care of my mother? Sarah asked, her voice carrying the devastating honesty that only children possess when they've learned the worst truths about adult behavior. Your mother made choices that put her family in danger, Volkov replied. I'm offering you the chance to make better choices. I am making better choices, Sarah said, and she pulled the locket's chain over her head, holding it up so everyone in the chamber could see it clearly. I choose to make sure everyone knows what you did to those 17 people. I choose to make sure my mama's death means something, and I choose to trust the man who loved her enough to spend 20 years protecting the truth. The standoff stretched for eternal seconds, with Ezra's finger on the detonator, Sarah holding the locket that contained the key to bringing down a criminal empire, and Volkov's men calculating angles and possibilities with the desperate energy of people whose lives depended on making the right decision in the next few seconds. You pull that trigger, old man, and you kill the girl too, Volkov said, playing his final card. Maybe, Ezra agreed, but I'd rather see her die free than live as your property. And I'd rather see this mine become her monument than let it remain your private graveyard. Sarah made the choice that ended the standoff. With a motion too quick for anyone to stop, she threw the locket not toward Volkov's men or toward the passage that would lead to safety, but directly at Ezra's feet. Make sure it gets to the right people, she said, her voice carrying across the chamber with the clear certainty of someone who'd found her purpose in the worst possible circumstances. Ezra's eyes met hers for one final moment, and in that look passed all the love he'd felt for her mother, all the regret for chances missed and words unspoken, and all the pride he felt in the daughter Elena had raised to value truth above safety. Tell them about Elena, Sarah said. And then she was moving toward the airshaft passage with the speed and agility that only children possess when their lives depend on quick reactions. Volkov's men opened fire immediately, but Ezra was already triggering the charges that would bring down the Elena mine forever. The explosion, when it came, shook the entire mountain and could be felt for miles in every direction. In the ranger station 15 miles south, emergency personnel felt the ground tremble and saw dust rising from the mountain peaks. They would find Sarah Whitmore emerging from an old mining airshaft 3 hours later, carrying her mother's locket and a story that would make headlines across the country. The Elena mine was gone, collapsed into a crater that would serve as a monument to the 17 people who died for trying to do what was right. But their stories would finally be told. Their families would finally know the truth, and the criminal organization that had buried them would face justice at last, somewhere in the rubble that had once been the evidence chamber. The key to safety deposit box 247 waited to unlock secrets that would bring down corrupt officials, expose decades of murder and conspiracy, and prove that some truths are too important to stay buried forever. Sarah Whitmore emerged from the mountain alone, but not defeated, carrying her mother's legacy and the knowledge that Ezra McCallum had kept his promise to protect Elena's daughter, no matter what it cost him. The battle was over, but the war for justice was just beginning. The new family photograph that Sarah would treasure for the rest of her life existed only in her memory, but it was more real than any image captured by cameras could ever be. It was the picture of herself and Ezra that last morning in the cabin, when he'd taught her to make coffee the way soldiers learned in the field, and she'd shown him how to braid her hair the way her mother had done every day before school. 6 months after the Elena mine collapsed into history and justice, Sarah sat in the Denver courtroom where Marcus Volkov was receiving his sentence, life without parole for 17 counts of murder, plus additional charges for racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy that would ensure he never breathed free air again. The safety deposit box key had unlocked exactly what Elena had promised, a treasure trove of evidence so comprehensive that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore it. The defendant will be remanded immediately to federal custody. Judge Catherine Morrison said, no relation to Elena, but Sarah felt the coincidence of names was her mother's way of ensuring justice came full circle. The court also wishes to commend the bravery of the witness whose testimony made this conviction possible. Sarah looked up from her seat in the gallery, where she sat between her new guardian, FBI agent Maria Santos, sister of one of the victims found in the Elena mine, and the victim services counselor who'd helped her navigate the complex process of testifying against one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the Western United States. The past 6 months had brought changes Sarah couldn't have imagined. During those desperate days in the mountain cabin, her father, Thomas Whitmore, had died in the mine collapse, and while Sarah grieved for the man he might have been, she couldn't mourn the man he'd actually become. More importantly, she'd discovered that Elena had made provisions for exactly this situation. Legal documents that appointed Agent Santos as Sarah's guardian if anything happened to both her parents. Your mother was smarter than any of us realized, Agent Santos had explained during their first meeting. She knew she was in danger, and she made sure you'd be protected by people who understood what she was trying to accomplish. The legal proceedings had been complex, but ultimately satisfying. 17 families had finally learned what happened to their missing relatives. Corrupt officials who'd covered up the crimes were facing their own charges, and a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for decades was being systematically dismantled by federal prosecutors who finally had the evidence they needed. Sarah, Agent Santos said as they left the courthouse, "There's something I want to show you." They drove to a small cemetery on the outskirts of Denver, where a new section had been established for the victims recovered from the Elena mine. 17 headstones bore the names of people who died for trying to do what was right. And at the center of the memorial was a marker that read, Elena Morrison Whitmore, beloved mother, fearless truth-teller, protector of the innocent. But next to Elena's marker was another stone, and this one made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Ezra McCallum, soldier, protector, keeper of promises. He brought them all home. The FBI wanted to recognize what he did, Agent Santos explained gently. 20 years of gathering evidence, protecting witnesses, and finally making the sacrifice that brought justice for everyone. He earned the right to rest with the people he spent his life trying to protect. Sarah knelt beside Ezra's marker and placed her hand on the carved granite, feeling the warmth that late afternoon sunshine had stored in the stone. "Thank you for keeping your promise," she whispered, touching her mother's ring where it hung on a chain around her neck. She'd grown enough that it almost fit her finger now, but she preferred to keep it close to her. The months ahead would bring new challenges, as Sarah adjusted to life with a guardian who understood the weight of the secrets she carried and the trauma she'd survived. There would be therapy sessions to help process what she'd experienced, educational assessments to determine how her interrupted schooling could be resumed, and quiet conversations about the difference between justice and revenge. But there would also be good things. Agent Santos lived in a house with a garden, where Sarah could grow the flowers her mother had loved. She would attend a school where her intelligence would be challenged and her resilience would be respected. And she would grow up knowing that when evil seemed overwhelming, sometimes ordinary people could still make choices that changed everything. "Do you miss the mountain?" Agent Santos asked as they drove home from the cemetery. Sarah considered the question seriously, the way she'd learned to consider all questions since those days in the cabin when getting things wrong could mean the difference between life and death. "I miss him," she said finally. "I miss the way he made me feel safe even when everything was dangerous. I miss the way he talked about Mama like she was the most important person who ever lived. But I don't miss being afraid all the time, and I don't miss feeling like I was all alone in the world." "You're not alone now," Agent Santos said gently. And you never have to be alone again. As summer turned toward autumn, Sarah began 8th grade at a school where her teachers knew she'd experienced things that most adults never face, but where she was still expected to master algebra and write book reports like any other student. She made friends cautiously but genuinely, learning to trust again while keeping the parts of her story that were too heavy for children to carry. In the evenings, she would work in the garden with Agent Santos, learning to coax life from soil and seeds the way Ezra had taught her to coax fire from wetwood and direction from star patterns. The flowers they grew were living things that bloomed and faded with the seasons, unlike the metal and stone flowers in the cemetery where her mother rested. The flowers that never die, Sarah said one evening as they planted bulbs that would bloom the following spring, remembering her mother's cryptic message about where important things were kept safe. "What's that?" Agent Santos asked. "Something Mama used to say. I thought she meant the cemetery flowers. But I think she really meant the memories we keep alive by telling the truth about people we love." On the anniversary of the mine collapse, Sarah returned to the Colorado mountains with Agent Santos and a small group of federal officials who were dedicating a memorial at the site where the Elena mine had once operated. The crater had been filled and landscaped, and a simple monument listed the names of all the victims who'd been recovered from the tunnels. But Sarah spent most of the ceremony looking up at the peaks around them, remembering the sound of Ezra's voice teaching her to read weather patterns in cloud formations and the feel of her mother's ring warming against her thumb during those cold mountain nights when she'd learned what it meant to have someone willing to die to protect you. "They're both still here," she said quietly to Agent Santos as the official ceremony concluded and the other visitors began making their way back to the parking area. "In the memorial, you mean?" "Everywhere," Sarah said, gesturing toward the mountains that surrounded them. "In the trees Ezra taught me to identify, in the rocks where Mama's evidence was hidden, in the sky that covers all the places where people do brave things, even when they're scared." As they drove away from the memorial and back toward Denver, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since the morning her father had driven away and left her at a stranger's cabin. A sense of completeness, as if all the scattered pieces of her life had finally arranged themselves into a picture that made sense. She had a home where she was wanted and protected. She had a guardian who understood that strength could coexist with kindness, and that justice was worth pursuing even when it required sacrifice. She had the knowledge that her mother's death had meaning and that Ezra's promise had been kept. Most importantly, she had learned that families weren't just about blood relationships, but about people choosing to protect and care for each other, regardless of the cost. Elena had chosen to protect Sarah, even knowing it might cost her life. Ezra had chosen to protect them both, despite 20 years of solitude and grief. Agent Santos had chosen to build a new life around a child who'd survived things that should have broken her spirit, and Sarah had chosen to honor all of their sacrifices by living a life worthy of the love they'd given her, by speaking truth even when it was difficult, and by remembering that some promises are too important to break, no matter what they cost. The new family photograph might exist only in memory, but it would last longer than any image printed on paper. It was the picture of people who'd chosen love over fear, justice over safety, and hope over despair. It was the picture of a family forged not by genetics, but by the decision to protect what mattered most, regardless of the personal cost. As they reached the city limits of Denver, Sarah touched her mother's ring through her shirt and smiled at the thought that Eleanor Morrison Whitmore would be proud of the daughter she'd raised and the legacy she'd created. The little girl who'd been abandoned as punishment had grown into someone who understood that the most important lessons about family, justice, and courage couldn't be taught in classrooms, but had to be learned in the crucible of impossible choices and absolute love. The mountain would always be with her, not as a place of fear and desperation, but as the location where she discovered who she was meant to become and what she was capable of achieving, when the people she loved were counting on her to be brave.